A few years ago in 1989, as I remember, a high school dropout from Brooklyn with a long reputation as a very serious troublemaker became the first woman ever known to have sailed around the world alone. This feat was made even more spectacular since the teenage girl who set sail when she was 17 had no nautical experience. She was a Brooklyn kid. Pat knows. Indeed, in her book about this event, Maiden Voyage, she confesses to cheating on her Coast Guard navigation exam, which she had to pass in order to have the right to sail out of New York City Harbor. Tanya taught herself to read charts when the radio on her 26-foot boat announced an onrushing hurricane, and she knew if she couldn't find Bermuda Harbor, Bermuda's the only thing out there, that she would soon be dead. Tanya was 17 when she dropped out of high school to do that sail. Now, that was 16 years ago. A few months ago, another young woman who dropped out of an American high school at age 16, Danica Patrick, almost won the legendary Indianapolis 500 auto race. She was in the lead with 7 laps to go, hitting 226 miles an hour on average, the first woman ever to have held a lead in that race in its 89-year history. The reason she didn't finish first was her pit crew had failed to put the right amount of gasoline in her car. After dropping out of school at 16, Danica went to England on her own without a chaperone or any kindly relative to watch over her, and signed herself in to a ruthless driving school unique in the world. It was for the racing circuit, where she learned to sustain a vehicle speed above 200 miles an hour. In her first Indy try, Danica, aged 23, finished, as I told you, 4th, opening a world of opportunity for women who like to drive 226 miles an hour in auto racing. Her winnings were a mere $330,000, but that pittance was supplemented by $2 million in product endorsements, enough to keep her out of the poorhouse as she enters her 24th year on Earth without any degrees. Incidentally, her total driving experience prior to her frightening English adventure had been in go-karts. Do you see some similarity then between Danica and auto racing and Tanya Ivey in around the world solo voyages? It's worth a moment of reflection thinking about what kind of schooling prior to the age of 16 might have been of maximum use to Danica. Certainly none of the cautious fraidy cat varieties that most of us are used to. In 1986, a 5'11" Eskimo girl from Siberia dropped out of school at the age of 13. Actually, she was lured from her home and her school in Ulan-Ubi by a Chinese entrepreneur who, along with a group of other girls, had lured Irina Panteva to go with him to northwestern China. Picture that in your mind, northwestern China, where he promised to make her a supermodel. Okay? That was her Siberian dream, as she wrote in her book, Siberian Dream, which was published a few years ago. Irina and her companions woke up not in a modeling agency, but in a Chinese house of prostitution some weeks later, penniless, not speaking the language, a pathetic dropout who became in short order pregnant and was delivered of a child. Now, be good, well-conditioned Americans and predict in your own mind what the future held for this penniless dropout living in a house of prostitution in northwestern China, not speaking the language. Predict her future. She was surely at the end of the line, right? In a dog-eat-dog world where college graduates are sweating in many places, right? I understand that of the graduating class of my daughters at MIT, it was 1986, I think, 40% of them were unemployed or very lightly employed. But Irina hadn't swallowed the assumptions upon which our society and our economy are founded, and she knew that this was no time to panic, or she would surely lose her Siberian dream of being a high-fashion model. So with some of the other involuntary prostitutes, she escaped the brothel, and by putting on shows for Chinese villagers along the way, like some strange reincarnation of Mickey Rooney in his early films with Judy Garland, she earned enough money for food, for lodging, and for train fare until, after 2 long years doing this, she escaped China with her baby, penniless, and still a dropout. What was a 15-year-old girl with no money and a baby to do now? Her entire assets were that dream of being a supermodel. By hook and by crook, by cleaning toilets and doing whatever else came along, she somehow got to Paris. Do read her book. Your librarian can secure Siberian Dream for you. Every model agency she approached in Paris told this 5'11" Eskimo that she was funny looking and not model material. And I must tell you, even though it reveals some awful weakness, that looking at her in the book, she looked funny looking to me. What can I tell you? I'm from Pittsburgh. And so Irina passed 3 years sleeping on floors in Paris, doing menial labor until her kid was 6 years old. But her dream never died. She was sure if she could only get to America, she could make that dream a reality. So parking the kid at a temporary crash pad offered by a friend, she wangled herself a visa and arrived in New York City at age 18 with $15 in her pocket and an overnight bag. No contacts, no place to sleep, $15 in an overnight bag. 18 years old, destitute, without a college diploma, and funny looking. 1 year later, she was on the cover of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She was a fixture at the best Manhattan parties. She was cast in a Woody Allen movie, and she was earning thousands of dollars an hour, $5,000 an hour for the cover shoots. Tanya, Danica, Irina, what they represent to me is the promise locked up in all of us, which institutional schooling steals. Schooling would have discouraged all three from sailing around the world alone without proper training, from roaring around a race track at 226 miles an hour, from daring to believe that a funny-looking Russian Eskimo without money or a patron could make her way alone to the United States and become a supermodel. This world of reality, not fantasy, reality, is at work all around us, although it's very difficult to penetrate into it and select out the people who are displaying with their lives and their energies that an entirely different and much better reality exists than the one sold by organized schooling or by an establishment view of the steps you climb. Schools would have laughed at the possibility that a born-again Christian from a homeschooled, unschooled family in Western Virginia could become a Harvard graduate and the head of the most important scientific project on planet Earth, the Human Genome Project. But Francis S. Collins did just that, acing out of the competition at the moment the fellow who was odds on to get it, who himself was close to being a school dropout, who had gone out of high school in California with a D, having cut every other day in school to go water skiing, who was a private in the Army in Korea or Vietnam, and who came very, very close to becoming the head. I believe they're co-heads now. Eric Schultes, who's here and is shining these lights in my eyes, will know who I've just referred to, although his name. Eric, where are you?
Right here.
Who am I talking about?
Craig Venter?
Craig Venter, yes. Venter's there are young people here, so I won't say son of a bitch, but Venter is the horrible human being who was neck and neck with the born-again Christian. Neither one of them followed an ordinary route to the most important scientific work on earth, my opinion. What all these people represent to me is the loss of wealth in our common life, which occurs when institutional schooling steals our moment of maximum power and promise, replacing it with lockstep procedures and bogus evaluations. The kind of forced confinement imposed on our young for a little more than 100 years has had very little to do with reading, writing, and arithmetic, little to do with developing character, and has had only an artificial connection with opportunity, a connection enforced by preempting huge sections of work and rationing it out based on grades and test scores. It's a childishly simple task to demonstrate that none of us, not you sitting in this room or anyone outside this room, believes that grades or test scores on paper pencil tests measure merit. It's not a matter of opinion, but one of common experience. If you actually believed that grades and test scores sorted the cream from the milk, you would never dream of hiring a doctor, a lawyer, an architect, a barber, or a cook without investigating their test rankings. No school would be corrupt enough to hire superintendents, principals, teachers, without demanding they hang their SAT scores and their GPAs on a placard outside their door for all to see. If these things mattered, it would be the public's right to know in order to make a sensible decision, how to be an informed consumer without this information. The truth is that paper pencil scores are worthless predictors of quality, but unmistakably, they do measure something important. They measure obedience and tractability. They measure the future fit of the testee into systems of all sorts. You should never allow such pornographic invasions of your children's minds. Your kids should politely leave test papers behind. And when asked why they did so, they should reply, "I prefer not to," as Bartleby the Scrivener preferred not to. "I prefer not to" should be good enough reason in a free country. But if you're absent as I might be this display of moral courage, there's another way to puncture the testing balloon, and I mean very, very quickly to collapse it. If children must surrender intimate information to total strangers on the false justification that memorizing the dots can discriminate quality accurately enough to divide children and apportion opportunity, then people who consume government services have the right to demand similar information from all public servants in order to make informed choices. If that concession were won, everyone in this room would be aware that in the last presidential election, the winner was a 76 average C student over 4 years at college, and the loser was a 75 average C student. You'd learn that in the prior election, Mr. Gore was a flunk out from Vanderbilt and a CD student at Harvard, that John F. Kennedy was a C student, just like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The biggest difference academically between the two is that Roosevelt boasted of his C average. You'd learn that the legendary progressive senator Paul Wellstone had a combined score on his SATs of 800 out of a possible 2,400. You'd learn all these hair-raising facts and many more which would cause you to challenge the root assumptions of forced schooling, as Tanya, Danica, and Irina should cause you to challenge your own beliefs, perhaps, that human beings at age 13 or 16 or 17 are actually children at all. If that's true, and most of human history would say it was true, whatever corner of the world you searched, you'd discover that no one in their right mind thought that people of 12 were children and should remain year after year under the domination, the dominion of wiser heads. That you'd learn that young people are really captives of a desperate utopian scheme to hold them subordinate to the will of managers. A vast utopian scheme to extend their childhoods far beyond the natural term so they might better fit the hierarchical nature of corporate economies and corporate societies. An excerpt from the diary of one of the Columbine killers was printed without commentary as a sidebar in Harper's Magazine a few years back. Since I've read it, it's been impossible for me to keep it out of mind. The boy said that his life had been so trivialized. He, of course, was writing for an audience of one himself. His life had been so trivialized that he had arrived at the threshold of what is now popularly believed to be manhood without ever once having done anything significant in his life, nothing significant at all, that nothing he had ever done mattered. Now, this wasn't some poor black ghetto chap who had never eaten off a tablecloth. This was a very, very rich young man who had everything money could buy, whose home had been carved out of a single enormous boulder. I know how unfair it is to task you with the compulsory confinement aspect of an institution you had no part in creating, but my job, as I see it, is to provoke you into seeing that tacit complicity in serving this scheme is complicity nonetheless. It was only when I ultimately was able to work out a strategy to sabotage the subject-driven compulsory attendance provision of forced schooling that my school teaching job, which I defined for myself as being useful to young people, not in the abstract, collectively, but to each one individually and particularly, that my job became much easier as an explosion of productivity, resourcefulness, concentration, and self-reliance was the result of this sabotage. I freed my kids of the terrible obligation of being children when they were not. I did that as often as I could, and they rewarded me for 30 years beyond my wildest dreams. Over the last 15 years I spent in the classroom, I came to see that I was learning much, much more than I was teaching. Try to see the horrifying, soul-deadening waste of human energy that confinement schooling entails. If you add the institutional schooling period to the old age disenfranchisement we've arranged for our citizens, we waste well over half of our national pool of imagination. That, inventiveness, and many other good things that we can't really afford to throw away anymore. By the age of 12, Benjamin Franklin was working 60 hours a week at a real job and using his spare time to take a first-class education from the living world around him. Read his truly astonishing autobiography to learn the details of his curriculum. Read it carefully with a notebook in hand, and I promise you, you'll never look at 12-year-olds as children again. And just as soon as you throw away the rules of child development, which have been carefully conditioned into you, theories based on averages, so guaranteed to break down in the fact of no two alike young people with no two alike fingerprints, your teaching will improve dramatically. By the age of 12, our dumbest founding father, George Washington, roundly considered to be a dull fellow by his friends and neighbors, had studied trigonometry, geometry, and surveying at the hands of a jailed criminal, the only man silly enough to want to teach. And he had also studied architecture, shipbuilding, clothing design, and clothing construction. He says somewhere in his writing that you'd have to be an idiot to allow somebody to make your clothing for you, since that was the first impression you gave to the outside world, and you wanted something that important under your own control. But he also had studied formally public speaking, farming, finance, and persuasive writing. Of all those things, he said ballroom dancing and horseback riding were the two most valuable things he ever learned. And other people said that too. They said that when Washington entered a room, his carefully balanced, dynamic physique was so powerful that everyone just stopped speaking and looked at George. And when he was asked how he got that way, he said, ballroom dancing and horseback riding. I recommend it. And he did all these things on his own as an unschooler. By the age of 12, Thomas Jefferson managed a large plantation of 2,500 acres on his own, his parents both dead. He also managed 250 employees. He met budgets, he did purchasing. By the age of 12, Ensign David Farragut, one day to be the very first admiral in the American Navy, was captaining a captured British warship with orders to sail it from Peru to Boston without a school teacher in tow or a parent to monitor his progress. By the age of 12, Thomas Edison had a very profitable business up and running 1,000 miles from home with no cell phone to call mommy when he got into trouble. Artificially extending childhood is the way schools use to cripple the majority of our population, lifelong. Many parents have been gulled into assisting this procedure. Don't you be one of them. So far, I've shown you 3 of the important weapons of mass instruction which schools employ. They misdirect attention away from important things, such as the evidence all around us that rather large numbers of successful young people are doing incredible things under the radar of school-driven urgency. They deny thousands of years of wisdom about how people actually learn by doing. They substitute the memorization of dots and the regurgitation of these dots on examinations for practicing connecting the dots in uniquely personal ways, which actually constitutes an education. They condition us to a bold lie. I know this looks like 4 weapons, but hey. The test scores are a fair way to apportion privileges. Misdirection of attention, the basic principle of magic, as Pat Farenga, a notable magician himself, just informed me. Misdirection of attention, the theft of raw experience time, the denial of critical thinking through rigid routines and testing. These weapons of management preclude the emergence of a sovereign self. But a major enterprise is now underway to extend even further the reach of this enterprise into all our lives instead. And that's the subject I'll turn to next before concluding with some further consideration of other sophisticated weapons of mass instruction used against school children. On 28 February 2005, not so long ago, the world's wealthiest man delivered a speech to America's 50 state governors, a speech which resonated worldwide. In it, he urged every state executive to make it a crisis priority to transform the schools of each state into universal laboratories of college preparation for everybody. No student should be left behind. States should become responsible for supplying funds for all who lack the means. Our national future depended on this happening, he said. A college education is now so essential, he said, for individual and national competitiveness that this all-enveloping school project should become the spearhead of America's advance into the future. Now, school crusades of some magnitude have been an enduring theme throughout American history, starting long before Horace Mann's push in the mid-19th century to make schooling compulsory after the Prussian model. If you need some evidence that our schools are modeled after the schooling of the military state of Prussia, you need only read Horace Mann's 7th letter to the Boston School Committee, which your librarian can probably touch in the stacks of even small libraries in Massachusetts. And you will see that he falls on his knees begging for the Prussian system to come to Massachusetts. And from Massachusetts, it spread all over the world, not just the country. But none of these initiatives have ever emanated from such an unlikely symbolic center as Bill Gates. I first heard about the Bill Gates speech from some English language newspapers I bought at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam after I'd lost all my money at the casino there. I only had enough left for newspapers, while I was waiting for a plane to Guangzhou, China. And I read Gates' words on the way through the sports pages, with none registering as anything more than customary hyperbole. So it was with some surprise I learned upon landing in the enormous city which used to be called Canton that my Chinese hosts seemed to want to talk about nothing else. Furthermore, the local press in China was full of Gates, or so I was told, and the internet was buzzing with Gates commentary. Setting aside the venal possibility that schools and colleges are such a money tree for Microsoft, he hardly could have spoken otherwise at the National Education Summit, I was impressed with the boldness, the cheek, the profound chutzpah of a famous dropout lecturing the nation on the necessity of a college education when he had none. If it were as necessary as he said, I asked myself, why hadn't he bothered to go back to college in all those decades since he left after his freshman year, I might add? What improvements would college have made in Gates' current situation? If it were only Gates in this uncollege status, I might overlook the irony of a university being proposed as a solution to America's economic woes, which are horrible and are getting worse. But it isn't only Gates who has written himself a pass from the expensive and time-consuming ritual of college, and well, Mr. Gates knows it. He did drop out after a single year and never went back, but then so too did his partner in the founding of Microsoft, Paul Allen, who's worth 15 or 20 billion. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, dropped out of Reed College after one semester, and eventually he hooked up not with a Stanford graduate, not with an MIT graduate, but with Steve Wozniak, another dropout who co-founded Apple with him. Michael Dell of Dell Computer didn't bother with a college degree either. Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, saw through the illusion of seat time in college being peddled as education at an early enough age to spare himself its pernicious effects. And I could go on in this vein for some time, but I think I've made the point at least about the computer phenomenon. Its vital genius is in large measure a gift to the rest of us from men who turned their backs on college. Would this technical revolution be sweeping the planet if Gates or Dell or Jobs had remained in college? Or for that matter, if John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, or Henry Ford had? Don't be too quick to answer that question, or you'll be certain to embarrass yourself. You get some measure of the near uniformity of news control in America when you find slight mention of this awesome data, nor hear such questions publicly asked. Is it any wonder critical thinking has been in exile from institutional schooling? If you feel like joining the throng of fans for Gates' college proposal, if you strongly believe he was telling it as it really, really is, then you are obligated to explain why it doesn't seem to be that way in one of the principal businesses keeping us afloat in the global marketplace. You need to explain to yourself first and to me second precisely what it is about seat time, canned lectures, vetted textbooks, homework, and paper pencil testing which creates a vigorous, productive intellect. Can you do that? Don't feel bad if you can't. Nobody can. It's an act of religious faith, not science. Computers aren't the only dropout business cutting a swath through China, where really it's difficult to believe what a visitor sees with his own eyes. So startling is the dynamism on display there. Take food, though, as the next example. Guangzhou is considered in China to be the culinary capital of China. The number of fine little inexpensive restaurants and cafes strikes any visitor as legion. They're everywhere, and they seem to do a good enough trade to keep their proprietors in modest prosperity. But an explosion of American fast food franchises there looks as if it will one day overwhelm the intricate culture of thousands of years of culinary insight by the Chinese, with its broad palette of flavors, textures, colors, aromas. The sheer density of McDonald's, KFC's, Taco Bell's, Burger King's, Dunkin' Donuts, Subways, and all the rest in Guangzhou, excuse my accent, is more like what you'd see on the approaches to Las Vegas or LA than like their more modest expression in lesser American cities. And all of them were packed wall to wall with young people. How do I know? Because the only place to get a cup of coffee in China is in one of these spots, familiar spots. So as I sat there, easily the senior member of the congregation in these places, I was just dazed. Young people shooting the breeze, young people studying there, young people Americanizing themselves. Most of the conversation I heard was in English. Every third body was banging away on a computer in English, and I'm not talking about a specialized college crowd either. This expression of affection for what McDonald's and Company was peddling was everywhere I looked in the 4 days I spent in town. It was a choice. If a body wanted real food, food drenched in genius, the amount of choice was staggering in Guangzhou. And most often, it was cheap. But food isn't what fast food restaurants sell. I'm sure many of you have figured this out by now. They sell something, but it isn't food. In competition with the ancient culinary genius of sophisticated China, what we offer is childhood simplicity, and they merely offer food. They offer 1,000 flavors. We offer 2, salt or sweet. They offer dim lighting so that a family dining can concentrate on itself, the crowd only dimly perceived. We offer bold lighting in which the crowd is the show, its antics on display openly. Their decor is as formal, traditional, and unique as the owner can manage. Ours is all bright primary colors, reds, yellows, blues, designs which deliberately surrender themselves all at once to the eye. Their atmosphere is hush, quiet, all sounds muted. Ours loud and noisy. They collect payment after the meal, presenting a small but not inconsequential psychological strain on the person who has to pay the check, a stress compounded by the expectation on the part of the server for some unknown gratuity. In our fast food world, everything is paid in advance, everything is self-served, obviating a tip. In the area of food textures, the Chinese restaurant presents a large variety, thoughtfully considered. In the fast food arena, the preferred cooking texture is mush, regardless of what you order. And finally, the supreme coup de grace. I think this attracted the Chinese kids. Toilets. Our toilets transferred to China are still brightly lit, spotlessly clean, spacious, plenty of hot water, places where everything works and where it's a pleasure to contemplate evacuating one's food. But alas, in the Chinese side of the arena, in devising that brilliant cuisine, one available even to people of modest income, the Chinese spirit overlooks the decisive moment of saying goodbye to the food. How you handle that in China is an ordeal you face without assistance from management, the last foul memory of the nourishment interval. In a word, they had made the toilet experience deeply unpleasant. And I would add often here as well. Chinese restaurants prepare and serve food to mature souls. American fast food has been brilliantly conceived to appeal to the child in all of us. That same child lives in every Chinese too, however. If the evidence in Guangzhou that our killer fries have won the day means what I think it does. Good for America, good for the bottom line in Chinese medical practice, a good deal all around, and a business which is the principal source of work in the United States that we owe to dropouts. Ray Kroc of McDonald's, one of 12 kids, dropped out of high school. Colonel Sanders of KFC left school at age 12. Dave Thomas of Wendy's left home at age 12 to live at a YMCA, dropped out of high school at 15. Bill Kusenberg of Dunkin' Donuts dropped out at 14. Fred DeLuca of Subway dropped out of high school, borrowed $1,000 at age 17, and started his company. Carl Karcher of Carl's Jr. dropped out after 8th grade, helped his father, who was a sharecropper farmer, and worked 12 to 14 hours a day. Like the computer world, the fast food world acts as a strong right arm of the American economy, and it is exclusively the product of a dropout mentality. Whatever objections you may have to its ultimate cultural value, unless you can think of some other way to employ 1.5 million farm workers, that invisible army of fellow Americans who count on the fast food industry to be the largest purchaser of potatoes, tomatoes, lettuce, it's number one in all these categories, pickles, milk, juice, apples, beef, chicken, and fish, the largest purchaser of wood pulp for napkins, the largest buyer of plastic garbage bags, plastic knives, forks, spoons, paper plates, the largest distributor in the world of toys, and much more. You'll just have to bite your tongue because we go down the drain when they do. It's hard to imagine how horrifying our balance of trade ledger or our unemployment figures would be without this industry created by dropouts. Good for American business, good for American medical practices, good for farmers and toy makers, good for obesity clinics and diet doctors, less work for mother. I haven't quite finished my China story or my dropout story either. I've saved the best for last. It may be true that China now runs the world economy and that from this new perspective, global monetary policy is now made in Beijing, not Washington. I'm not smart enough to have concocted that statement. The London Economist argued that exact point in the July 30th, 2005 issue on page 11. That may be so, but if another dropout industry I saw at work on every street corner in Guangzhou means what I think it means, our dropouts are busy colonizing the Chinese mind and controlling its ambitions. Let me explain. Guangzhou, that enormous city which used to be Canton, the center of Chinese cuisine, a major natural bridge between West and East, is now encased in a bubble of all-American commercial entertainment, a fact which hardly bodes well for the Chinese cultural future or for the survival of its historic logic of social organization. If the data my eyes and ears assembled from a 96-hour stay were reduced by half, I would still believe that China has a colossal emergency occurring in the minds of its people, particularly its young. An emergency which has doubled and redoubled since my first visit there 5 years ago. A crisis of imagination provoked by the American entertainment industry, which is flagrantly in your face wherever you turn in Guangzhou. If you think that Las Vegas or New York City or LA is the place to go to be dazzled by our star system and canned music and all the rest. You're wrong. Go to Guangzhou, and I would be willing to extend that to Shanghai and Beijing too. Wherever you turn in Guangzhou, American movies, American songs, American TV shows, advertising, CDs, DVDs, traveling acts at major hotels and arenas is there. You name it. I recall fleeing from this show business facade to what I thought would be a real Chinese tea house on the Pearl River, or at least looking from a height, I could see that no one was in the place but Chinese. So I said, I will go there and have a nice Chinese pot of tea. And I got into the place, I ordered my tea, and gradually I became aware that there was something eerie going on. Not a soul around me was speaking. And everyone in the place had their head tilted up in the air. So while waiting for my tea, I tilted my head up in the air. And so help me God, what I encountered was a gigantic television screen with the sound off, playing the visit of the Minnesota Timberwolves to the Detroit Pistons. And the heads were following American professional basketball soundlessly. It was just fascinating. Our characteristic forms of product-laden storytelling are conditioning the Chinese to think and react American. American show business is colonizing the Chinese inner life to the point where distinctively Chinese pop culture is no longer even a credible option for its young. In the competition to preserve American prosperity, we owe more than it's easy to measure to men like David Geffen of DreamWorks, who flunked out of Brooklyn College, to Yoko Ono, who dropped out of Sarah Lawrence, to Wayne Huizinga of Blockbuster Video, who logged 3 semesters, then quit, to Ted Turner, who was kicked out, to Bill Murray dropout, to Brad Pitt dropout, to Dustin Hoffman dropout, to Richard Gere dropout, to Sharon Stone dropout. Hey, we could stay at this until the decade ends, had we but time. Edmund Hamilton, the most successful catalog book dealer in America, I'll bet some of you have bought from the Hamilton catalog, wrote me a letter on June 20th, 2005, having read my underground history of American education. He said, high school was important for me. I learned to type there. That is all I learned in high school that I know of. I took only 3 college courses in my late 20s, and I was very glad the rest of the pack got out of the way so that I could conquer the world. It would be harder for people like me or Gates or Dell to become multimillionaires if everyone else was following the same path. Amen, Edmund, amen. Somehow this resonated with me because accidentally over the years I've often said to friends that the only thing I could locate of real value from my high school and college years was the ability to type. Everything else was background noise. I went to Cornell and I graduated from Columbia. Perhaps if I'd gone to better schools, my memories would be different. On April the 7th of this year, the New York Review of Books ran a long piece on the author William Faulkner, calling him, quote, the most influential innovator in the annals of American fiction. Faulkner was a high school dropout who was later able to enter the University of Mississippi on a special waiver for ex-military men. After a year there, he dropped out. His grade in English was D. He never went back. His Nobel Prize bio fails to mention this. Our other Nobel Prize winner, Ernest Hemingway, only had degrees when he caught a fever. Our immortal chronicler of the jazz age, F. Scott Fitzgerald, dropped out too, along with more important musicians, sculptors, painters than you can shake a stick at. I don't know who put Bill Gates up to the speech he made to the governors, but he ought to be ashamed for misdirecting national attention away from the urgent need to face the future with different solutions than we used to create our present. Our economy has prevailed against all comers for centuries because it was built out of inventiveness and imagination. Whether you like their particular manifestation or not, the three American economic juggernauts sweeping all competition in China were erected from nothing but imagination. Imagination and bizarre cow parts, you don't want to know which ones, in the case of fast food. Imagination and silica, grains of sand in the case of computers. Imagination and a variety of people pretending to be someone they aren't and to feel something they don't feel in the case of show business. It isn't accidental that these are phenomena not beholden to schools or colleges. Mass instruction ruins the imagination, leaving in its place habits and attitudes which guarantee not bigger lives, but shrunken, incomplete ones. This would only be an academic philosophical matter except for the fact that Gates is right about one thing. We are face to face with a gigantic economic and social challenge unlike anything we have ever seen before in our history. As the London Economist put it just a few days ago, China's growing influence stretches much deeper than the export of cheap goods. It is revolutionizing the relative prices of labor, capital, goods, and assets in a way that has never happened before. We need, in this crisis, to slap ourselves awake and see that schooling is the problem, not the solution, as Mr. Gates would have it. Notice I said schooling is the problem, not education. From the end of the Civil War to the end of World War II, we slowly designed and put into place a form of schooling which prevents education from happening. Over time, we fashioned people not to be better individuals morally, not to be better citizens, not to be the best, most effective sovereign individuals they could be, but for a utilitarian fourth purpose, to be functioning parts in an efficient corporate economy. For the past century, all else has been secondary in our schools. And while this design did not provide much happiness, it did provide great wealth and great power. Whatever you think about the morality of this great project of social engineering, it was an unparalleled highway to comfort and security. Nothing like it in history. But now its day is over. And all through the financial press, which is basically the only journalism I read anymore, since every item in our ordinary newspapers, from the Boston Globe to the New York Times to the LA Times, is spun some way by interests. On the other hand, the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or Forbes magazine and a number of other lesser known, they actually are held to account by their readers, so they can't be, I'd say, romantic or reassuring about news. So when 3 times over the last 2 years I read in the Financial Times editorial page that in India and China, 10 million engineers in excess of national needs have already been released, and that over the next 10 years, 50 million more engineers have been released into the world's supply, willing to work for 1/6 of the going rate in America. When you add that to the importance of engineering to our middle class nature as a country, I think you can see that no amount of working hard, it isn't that they're better engineers than we are, it's that they're as good and they work for 16 cents on the dollar. I mean, if you were an American contracting engineering, you'd be out of your mind to contract people from MIT or Carnegie Tech. Out of your mind. So, the strategy of the past, sending millions of ordinary people to schools and colleges, not to educate them, but to standardize them so that their output can be made predictable. Not only their output in production, but your output in behavior. I mean, every government since the beginning of time has to worry about destabilizing the society by having too many well-schooled or educated people unemployed. There isn't a respectable history book written for historians that doesn't say that was the cause of the Second World War. There were too many German college graduates and not enough work for them. They put together the Nazi Party and overthrew the German establishment. This is standard operating procedure in world history. So if you study government, I don't mean if you took a government course at BU, if you study government in a seminar at Harvard or Princeton, or maybe even a super seminar at Tufts, what you'll learn is how to manage people. You don't learn how to live up to the promise of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. You learn how to manage people. You learn how to see trouble on the horizon and to derail the trouble before it occurs. So the strategy of the past won't work for us. It never worked for ordinary people because in making workers more efficient, and I include doctors and lawyers when I'm in the term workers, it mutilated their inventiveness, their imagination, their originality, yet these are precisely the qualities we need to survive the challenge from China, India, Malaysia, and other rampant mass production economies. We need to add value to our products and services in a way that machinery can't, nor can people conditioned to behave like machinery. We need people, God help me for saying this, who understand that dining out isn't about food at all or handsome decor. It's a quest to be taken care of as we were taken care of as children. We need people who understand that lives of routine destroy the ability to dream, destroy the inner life to such an extent that a ravenous hunger for stories, illusions, melodramatic narratives like the nuclear arsenal of Iraq, or this evil skinny guy on a dialysis machine who lurks in the caves of Afghanistan is going to come out and scare us. We have a craving, a national craving, whose temporary satisfaction is in songs and narratives and pop journalism, and it's more addictive than a craving for cocaine. Just look back before the 20th century. In places like Monongahela, where I was born and grew up, there well into the 20th century, people made their own songs. People made their own stories, their own pageants. They didn't depend on some national voice saying, oh, put aside your childish efforts. We do it better. It's all been preempted and centralized in the interests of management. It makes a lot of people great fortunes, and it does, I think, addict us to sloth to sitting back and expecting someone else to entertain us. A population without an inner life has to struggle ceaselessly to fill the gap with made-up conflicts. In mid-March of 2005, Indiana University released a study of all school-based anti-smoking programs. California alone has spent $500 million in the past decade on this worthy goal. Sarah Weehee, the study's leading author, concluded that not a single one of the school programs had been successful. But then she added, as if in gratuitous cruelty, this devastating epitaph for the progressive dream of institutional schooling. I'm quoting now the head of the anti-smoking study. It may be that any program conducted in schools induces contempt in students. I read that in the International Herald Tribune of March the 24th, 2005, as I was driving from Limoges to the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane. Excuse my accent again. A community so unique it hasn't a single inhabitant. The population of Oradour, having been shot or burned to death on 10 June 1944 by retreating German forces in an attempt to intimidate the French countryside against harassing the German retreat. Every single one of the school children of the town was burned to death, locked in the town's church, along with their school teachers, all that is but one. The lone survivor was a bad boy, 8 years old, named Roger Godfrey, a boy accustomed to disobeying his school teachers. When the townspeople were summoned to the town square by the Germans, Oradour's school teachers, accustomed to following orders, said to the children, "Hurry, hurry, don't keep them waiting." And everyone complied except Roger, who, using his native wits, ran away and hid. Roger is alive today, right at this moment, at age 69, though all his classmates were burned to death long ago. As you weigh the merit of Bill Gates' appeal that we should extend schooling by another 4 years, you want to consider whether Oradour has something to teach us. According to the Financial Times of London, as I told you, millions and millions and millions of well-trained engineers are coming into the system from China and India, far more than China and India need. What Bill Gates didn't say in his speech is that he started a training college in China and in India for Chinese and Indians willing to be computer engineers at 1/6 of the going rate. In one arena other than the fantastic, will doubling, tripling, and quadrupling the number of college degrees held by Americans begin to face this problem just ahead for us. All other things being equal, I'm talking about freshman economics now. Doubling the supply of labor does one thing. It reduces the unit value of labor by half. If you triple the supply, by 2/3. If you quadruple the supply, by 3/4. Unless you believe in magic. It's not my intention to bring you a counsel of despair, quite the opposite. At the heart of what a real economy is a variety of ways to add value to other people's lives. Not value as you perceive it, but as they do. You can, of course, teach others to value what you do, and this can be done legitimately by reasoned persuasion, but most often it's done illegitimately by trickery or force. Past the eternal human requirements of food, shelter, water, clothing, and the like, an infinite field of values exists, waiting for discovery by those of heart, spirit, and imagination. It's this imaginative zone that our native genius once resided in, and it must be allowed to exist again. I say allowed because the vigorous imaginative energy on display in Ben Franklin's autobiography and in many other times and places in American history, an energy set free by our founding documents, has been substantially suppressed by algorithms of social control and corporate domination inculcated through the institution of forced schooling. A clue to the deadly sea change which has slowly transpired over the past half century can be caught from the 1992 graduation speech given at Widener College by then Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. O'Connor, addressing the graduates, said, quote, "Your challenge will not come in breaking new paths, but in deciding to choose among many paths open to you." The ironic matter is that 200 years earlier, Thomas Jefferson had addressed the graduating class of the University of Virginia, and he said this: "Good citizens always make the society they live in. Only bad citizens adapt themselves to fit the reality they inherit." That's quite a change in the national consciousness. The best scent for us to follow into the mysterious future is our unique commitment to jazz and to other helix sports which mimic jazz, which ever and ever writes new rules for itself. This genius has never been concentrated anywhere else on earth but here. I mean, it's agony to listen to Dutch jazz, and they think they've caught on to how to. It's agony to listen to it. It really is by the algorithm, by formulas. You know, you can predict where the changes will occur. Only imagination is going to part this Red Sea in front of us. The high priest of libertarian capitalism, David Ricardo, a famous classical economist, would understand. He said, "Abandon what you're doing in a mediocre way and concentrate on what you do best. Lead with your strength." We once produced things in an unusually efficient and wonderful way. Now other people have taken over that mechanical pattern, but no one's ever duplicated our jazz or, unfortunately, our mushy McDonald's burgers. The biggest barrier blocking an American national resurgence, economic, social, or spiritual, is the dead weight of our corporate society and the dead weight of its training ground, institutional schooling. During the suppression of Poland by Soviet tanks, at a time when the situation seemed hopeless, Pope Paul II rallied his Polish countrymen with these words. "Don't approve of this," he said. "The regime cannot survive without your approval. Don't approve. Don't be afraid. The future depends on you." Just so the regime of corporate pedagogy we suffer under can't survive either without social approval. As homeschoolers, I know you know this. Don't approve. Don't bring its procedures into your homes. Don't be afraid. The future depends on you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. God bless you. You're my inspiration. You are.